In fact, we've built a super crazy simple solar dehydrator out of stuff that was just on our property, an old scrap piece of glass and some 2x4s and a piece of metal roofing to go underneath.
The Ready Life, into the country.
Hi, I'm Nick Meisner.
And I'm Lisa, his wife.
And we want to welcome you back to the Ready Life podcast, where we help you become as independent as possible for your basic needs like water, food, heat, and the electricity that we so often depend on for these things. You know, most of the systems in our homes require electricity to a greater or lesser extent. In order to provide for your needs during a time when you can't buy or sell, you're going to need to be set up with one of these three options. One option is to be able to take care of all of your basic needs without any electricity at all. That's non-electric, Amish style, that kind of thing, you know.
Mm-hmm. Or you could set up a off-grid power system like we have and make your own electricity, so that way your systems will be able to function during that time.
That's right. That would be option number 2. And option number 3, which is my favorite option, is both. D, all of the above.
Yes.
You know, even if you make your own power, it's always a good thing to be able to live non-electrically if necessary. I like redundancy, and doing that gives you some redundancy because then you've got your normal systems in place. You're making the electricity off-grid to power them. And then if something breaks with those systems, for instance, with your water pump and your well, you know, so you're making your electricity to power that pump in the well, but what happens if the pump breaks? Or even off-grid power systems, even though if you set them up right, they're very reliable, they're man-made. Things can go wrong. And so it's great to have another option.
Backups.
Yeah, redundancy, exactly. So, you know, while we're huge advocates for off-grid power systems, it does require some money to set up the system up front. Probably not as much as you might think if you use the right strategies that we teach in the Ready Life Academy. We help folks set up with very high quality systems that where they don't really have to change much about their lifestyle, and for a fraction of the cost that you often are hearing of folks getting quotes for.
Yeah, we sure did it. We didn't have anything but a shoestring budget, but we were able to set up our own off-grid power system here.
Right.
So if we can do it,
done. Yeah.
You can do it too. And we live very comfortably, and including this business, we run off.
That's right.
Off-grid. So
that's right. So it can totally be done, but you know, even still, like I mentioned, anything man-made can break, or maybe that outlay of cash up front is not something that you can do right now, or maybe you don't want to. Not everybody wants to go off the grid, and it's not for everybody. So if that's your situation, then if you're not going to produce your own power sustainably, then you really, really need to go with option 1, that we mentioned, and that is to set up where you can operate, where you can make it without any electricity if you had to. Not that you would live that way right now, but just to have systems in place where you could take care of those basic needs, your water, your heat, food, these basic things without any electricity. Those are really your options.
And I just want to interject here. I was just thinking while he was talking about this, having backups is a really great idea, but something that you'll want to consider when you have those backups is to use them periodically. Mm-hmm. Whatever that backup might be, if you just get something and you just tuck it away, and then the emergency shows up and all of a sudden you need to use it and you drag it out and it's not working and you can't get it to work right. Sometimes it takes a little bit of practice to really get the hang of using some of the equipment that would be non-electrically. It doesn't come maybe quite as intuitive as you might think. And so if you have backups in place, periodically pull them out and just try and use them until you feel comfortable using them. So that way, when an emergency arises, you'll be able to pull it out and you'll be ready to roll.
That's right. So we've talked a lot about the options of, making your own electricity with off-grid solar power and things like that. But in this episode, we wanted to focus on the non-electric options because, like I mentioned, it's a great option for folks that don't want to go off the grid to have their backups set up, or it can be a great stepping stone. If you want to eventually go off the grid, but you're needing to save up, or you're just not in a location where you can do that, or whatever the case may be, it's a great first step to make sure that you've at least got your bases covered for non-electric stuff. So we wanted to just spend a little time going through some of these systems in our homes that are important and how you could deal with these in a non-electric manner. If the grid is down or if we're unable to buy or sell or something like that. So first off is water. How do you deal with water? We've talked about that in the past, but just briefly, the best option, the best non-electric option I know of is a hand pump. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole nother topic. We actually have a course coming up in the Ready Life Academy that's going to be all about this, how to pick the right one and how it works, and basically taking you from A to Z, getting you set up where your water system is set up where it can function without any electricity. And we'll also be doing a future podcast on that too to get you started on that path. But just briefly, hand pumps can handle static water levels down to 325 feet or so. And so most wells are possible with a hand pump. They can be a little spendy. There are some cheap options too. I'm not a huge fan of the cheap options, but if that's your budget, it is possible. And so that's really my first option. The best option that comes to my mind for water system is a hand pump on your well, because most folks in a rural setting have a well as their water source. Another option that's probably not going to work for most folks, but I'll just throw it out there. It's a well bucket. And when I say bucket, you might be thinking of a big bucket like this. And yes, that can work if you have a big hand dug well. But for most 6-inch wells and things like that, I'm talking about a length of 4-inch PVC with a flapper valve on the bottom that you can drop down a well, let it fill up with water, and then haul it up. And that's a non-electric option. The reason why I say it's not going to work for most folks is because that will not work if you have a electric pump down in the well. If you have anything else in that well, that would only work with a empty well where it's got nothing else in there. But if you've got a spare well on your property, that could be a cheap option, non-electric option for getting water out of there. Another thing to consider, if you have a creek on your property, a ram pump is a completely non-electric option for pumping water up. If your creek, as long as your creek has enough fall on it from the point it enters your property to the point it leaves, then you can harness the remarkable powers of a ram pump to pump it up many times higher than that amount of fall. And so lots of options there. If you pump it up to a cistern above your house where it can gravity flow into your house, or, all kinds of things like that can be worked out. And having said that, even a hand pump could be pumped up to a cistern that's above your house and gravity flow down to your house. So I digress. We could go down that rabbit trail of water systems for quite a while. I will restrain myself and leave it at that for now. But just saying, those are your main options for completely non-electric with a water system. Aside from rainwater, rainwater would be the other obvious thing. But I do not recommend that you depend entirely upon rainwater, because some parts of the country can go months without rain, and even the areas that do get consistent rain, they can experience droughts. And what do you do during a drought? That's a major problem. And so that's my 2 cents on that.
I was just thinking we should do a course on water systems.
Oh, that's on the docket.
The Ready Life Academy. So lots of different options. Another thing that I think about, so when we're talking about basic necessities, right, we talked about water, but another big one that a lot of people do spend time thinking about is food storage. Food storage is kind of really important. And I know some of you may be the type that go to the store before you make your dinner each evening. And then some of you might be weekly shoppers where you go and get your groceries once a week and then that's it. Kudos to you. And then there's some of us that strive for maybe once a month, with the exception of a few trips to get some fresh produce. But food storage is really an important part of your homestead. You don't have food and water, then you're not, that's kind of a basic necessity here.
Right.
You can't survive without it. So some of the ways that you can, do food storage, obviously we've talked about canning in the past, dehydrating.
What about freezing?
But well, freezing probably wouldn't be a very good option because if you don't have electricity, you're going to be very busily canning and dehydrating the food that you have in your freezer just to save it.
When you lose your power.
Once you lose your power, exactly. So I would not put a huge emphasis on freezing. There are some foods, granted, that I personally don't care for canned or dehydrated. So I actually do have a freezer and I do use it. We are off the grid, and if we weren't off the grid, I would still probably put those items in the freezer, recognizing that in an emergency, I'm going to be pulling them out very quickly and either dehydrating them or canning them up. So that way I'm saving that food instead of losing it.
So you don't want freezing to be a very large percentage of your food storage, or you're going to be up a creek without a paddle.
Yeah. So you want that to be more of a smaller part of your food storage.
And as far as the canning goes, it can be completely non-electric with, for instance, a propane stove. If you have a propane stove that is non-electric, you'd be surprised how many propane stoves are not non-electric. In fact, it's nearly impossible, not impossible, but it's very difficult to find a propane stove that's made nowadays that is completely non-electric. But that being said, it is possible, very possible to can non-electrically with propane. Even a little outdoor stove. We have a outdoor stove that we'll use for outdoor canning sometimes in the summertime. And so those are non-electric. That's an option if your indoor stove is an electric model.
And I just got to say, when you're doing your canning during harvest time, at least for me, it's so hot in the house. I really don't like canning in the house anyway. So we have a small propane little stove that we hook up to a propane tank and light it with a match. And that's where I like to do my canning. I'd prefer to do it outside just because then all that heat is dissipated outside and it doesn't heat my house up really bad.
And if you didn't have propane, you could build a campfire in your yard and can on that if you had to, So canning is something that is not directly tied to electricity is what we're getting at.
And I just have to say, if you want to take your canning to the next level, get a wood cook stove. Because
that's right.
Frankly, even if you don't have a wood cook stove, which we don't currently, we have in the past in our previous house. But
it's coming up when we rebuild.
As soon as we rebuild, we're going to be getting a wood cook stove because they are absolutely amazing. We'll probably talk a little bit more about them in just a minute. But I have just a regular wood stove, and I can can on that if I need to. You just have to get the fire hot and get a really big, good bed of coals in there, and then you can can even on your wood cook stove, your wood stove, rather. It's
just a little bit challenging because a lot of times the time of year when you're needing to can is the time of year when it's not super cold outside. And so, but I mean, you do what you have to. You can open the windows and sweat it out for a little while if you have to. But if you have other options, then that's more desirable than having to crank up the wood stove to can with. But yes, that's a great point. And as far as dehydrating, yes, most dehydrators are electric, but you can dehydrate with the sun. We have done it. In fact, we've built a super crazy simple solar dehydrator out of stuff that was just on our property, an old scrap piece of glass and some 2x4s and a piece of metal roofing to go underneath. And it works great. So there's all kinds of options. You can get fancy ones if you want to. You can build your own, but solar dehydrating is a thing. Works especially well in climates where the humidity is lower, obviously.
Yes.
If you're in a more humid climate, then you've got to have more air movement, and so you're going to have to pay special attention to that. And if you don't have the ability to use powered fans, then try and do everything you can to keep air moving in it. But it is certainly a possibility. And then another form of, I don't know if you'd call it, I guess you could call it food storage. It's, it's not, so I would say food storage rather than food preservation would be a root cellar.
Oh, yes.
Or a spring house. So in olden days, they would, in areas that were warmer climates, they would have a spring house where the cool water coming up out of a spring would keep it cooler, and they could store stuff in there. So something along those lines can be a great option for not preserving, but for storing food for significant periods of time if it's the right food. It's got to be keepers. And this is why, like you mentioned, it's great to be experimenting and actually living these things now so that you don't find out when the time comes that you're trying to store something that just does not keep well under any circumstances. But, your potatoes and your apples and your carrots and your all kinds of things, your sauerkraut and all sorts of things you can store in your root cellar.
Yeah, or even in a cool room if you live in a northern climate, or even in southern climates, some basements stay really nice and cool.
Yep.
And that's a great place to store your bulk food items or your produce from your garden, or even if you don't have produce from your garden, get that extra and have it stored. And, like I said, experiment with these things so that way ahead of time you won't be caught surprised.
That's right. So we talked about water, food storage, heat is another basic necessity. And we have, thankfully, some great options. In fact, of the basic necessities of life, heat is probably the one that is most commonly used in a non-electric manner. And the obvious answer is...
wood heat.
Drum roll. Wood heat. That's right.
Yes.
And so that's... I can't say enough good about wood heat. It's the only source of heat I'm aware of that is truly sustainable, where it's not only non-electric, but you can actually grow your own fuel, which is pretty awesome. And so, yes, there are other possible non-electric options like certain gravity flow fuel oil heaters or certain direct vent propane heaters. So yes, they are options, but they do require fuel. So that's just going to be usable until you run out of fuel with those. And so, they can be great as backup heaters, but for primary heat, I really recommend wood heat. And if you go with a wood cook stove, as we've been mentioning, then you get these other benefits. And there's even more to come that we haven't mentioned yet that we will in just a couple minutes.
So speaking of a wood cook stove, I just want to jump ahead to cooking and baking, because cooking and baking on a wood cook stove is so much fun, and it's so much easier than what you think. Like, a lot of people are really intimidated. I know I was really intimidated at the thought of cooking and baking in a wood cook stove. But once I tried and I started doing it myself, I actually found it was a lot easier cooking and baking in many respects on a wood cook stove than on a regular propane or, heaven forbid, a glass top or electric stove. I can't stand electric stoves. I grew up using an electric stove, and when I started cooking on a propane stove, that was wonderful. It was such a step up in the world. So going from propane to wood cook stove, it was mind-boggling. I couldn't believe how much more efficiently I was able to cook and bake things with a wood cook stove over even a propane stove.
There's just so much more surface area of connection when you're using big pots.
Yeah, especially when you're canning and you've got those great big canners. You've got a little propane stove. You just have this little flame that, can only get so big, but you've got this great big bottom. Mm-hmm. And so with the wood cook stove, the whole entire bottom of the canner is being heated evenly, and it's phenomenal. The wood cook stove is also something that, I guess I'm jumping ahead too far, aren't I?
No, go for it.
Like with one fire, I just have to say this. I love saying this. With one fire, you can heat your house, you can cook your food, you can bake your food, and you can heat your water, all with one fire.
And preserve your food.
Your food and dehydrate your food, all with one fire. The wood cook stove is really a great option for non-electric, solving a lot of challenges non-electrically.
Well, and you can see why it's the centerpiece of an Amish homestead.
Yes.
It's like I've heard that when a Amish couple gets married, that's their wedding gift a lot of times is a wood cook stove. And because it's the hub of most of your major systems that for the rest of us require electricity. So great option if you want to go the non-electric route. Mm-hmm. Also, while we're on the subject of cooking, we already mentioned propane stoves.
Yes.
Just be aware, most of them do use some amount of electricity. For some of them, it might just be a tiny little bit for a electronic sparker to ignite it. But even still, most of them down in the oven are going to have an electric glow bar that's using like 300 plus or minus watts whenever the oven is running. And so just be aware of that. There are still very few made that are either completely non-electric or battery powered, like with a little 9-volt battery. Mm-hmm. Peerless Premier, I think they're the main one that comes to my mind. There may be one or two others that have the battery powered option, but so it's harder than it used to be. And years ago you could get Standing Pilot, completely non-electric, but that's not much of a thing anymore. But anyway, just to mention that. And then Dutch ovens,
Oh yes, that's true.
We were just camping recently and friends of ours brought their Dutch ovens along and we're cooking and baking on the campfire. So that's a low cost. If you can't swing a wood cook stove right now, then that's at least a option for the cooking part. And I remember many, many years ago, probably 30 years ago or more, almost 35 years ago when we were just starting to get into this kind of stuff. And that was one of the early things that we did was when we were still in the city and we knew that we needed to have these basics covered, and Dutch ovens were our tool that we got to check the cooking box temporarily until we could relocate and get something more permanent set up. So great option there.
And there's it's so much fun. Like he mentioned, we were just out camping, and while we were camping with our friends, they had Dutch ovens, and we had cornbread and chili, and we made several cobblers. That was kind of a favorite. The kids would run around picking huckleberries, and then we would pull oats and pancake mix and all kinds of crazy stuff together and make cobbler each evening. And the Dutch ovens, they're so much fun to use. And get one and just practice. Try in your front yard a couple times.
Let's see. Some other systems, lighting. Not necessarily, not a basic necessity, but you could live without lighting. You go to bed with the chickens and get up with the chickens. But in our neck of the woods in the wintertime, you wouldn't get very much done if you went to bed with the chickens
And got up with
and
the
got up with the
chickens.
chickens because the days of daylight are not very long.
Pretty short.
So having some lighting is going to be a really, really helpful thing. And so for non-electric options, there's kerosene lamps, like Aladdin lamps. I remember when we, in our earliest days out here, before we got a solar system set up or batteries or an inverter or any of that, we were, there was no power nearby, and all we had was the generator, this big old generator. And of course, it drinks fuel, so we didn't want to run it very much. And so in the evenings, a lot of evenings, all we would be running was just lights, unless we were doing laundry. And that's just a tiny amount of power to be running a big generator. And so we actually had Aladdin lamps in those early days, and we would use them for lighting. And it was kind of nostalgic, It was kind of cool. I still remember those days with fond memories. And yes, a little bit of fumes in the house. I guess that's the downside, but it wasn't too bad. Keep your windows cracked and, some ventilation there. But candles might be another option. Also, I knew some other friends that had propane lamps. There is apparently such a thing because they had them permanently installed on their walls, and it was little propane lights. So that may be an option too.
Another option was my son was given a solar lantern for his birthday, and it has like a little solar panel on top, so it recharges the batteries during the day, and then he's got this really nice bright lantern that he uses in the evening in his bedroom.
So not technically non-electric, but doesn't require a full off-grid system.
Yeah, exactly. It's just small. And our friends had these little blow-up lantern things too that had little solar panels on. So something like that could be really helpful to have around too.
Or expanding on that a little bit, there are small battery packs made that you can attach solar panels to. Definitely not going to run your house. Please don't go down that trail. I've talked about that before. But for just powering a little bit of lights and a few small things, it can work. I would just say don't sink a lot of money into them, because some of those, you can sink thousands into those things, and you're just really blowing a lot of money because you're paying a lot for what you're getting compared to setting up an actual off-grid system with the components. But on a small scale, that could be a great option for you as well. What about laundry?
Oh, laundry. Yeah. Well, I did that for a few years. So non-electric laundry options. You obviously could go back to your great-grandmother's days and get one of those washboards and a nice big bucket for water, and do it the old-fashioned way with a washboard and a bucket of water.
Or even on a smooth rock. I've heard of people beating their clothes on a smooth rock.
That's true. That's true. I've done it that way before. When I was a kid, actually, we lived in an old farmhouse, and we didn't have any way to do laundry except the laundromat. And my folks kind of got tired of spending all that money at the laundromat, especially with 3 kids. And living in the country, we kind of went through laundry like water. So my mom made us wash our laundry on a washboard outside. And yeah, it's a good workout.
Yep.
But yeah, you can do it. And like you said, you can use some rocks, or just go wash in a river or a lake. I've done that before on camping trips even.
Or I've heard of these devices. They look like a toilet plunger.
Yes, that's true.
I think they're called rapid washer. I've seen them at Lehman's, and some friends of ours in the past had a business where they would sell these things. And I guess it was, you'd fill up a bucket with soapy water and put your clothes in there and do this up and down, and it would be like the agitator in a washing machine. So maybe something like that. Or if you want to get more elaborate, Lehman's, you may have heard of Lehman's. They're old Amish-style catalog that has a lot of non-electric things.
They're really cool.
Yeah, it is cool. If you ever get a chance to visit their store in Ohio, it's pretty cool, Kidron, Ohio. But they have something that used to be called the James washer, and now they've come up with their own version of the James washer. and it's a big tub where you could do laundry for a whole family, and it's got the hand agitator, and you can even get it with a wringer where it'll then wring the clothes out afterwards. Pretty pricey though. They are very spendy, and but if you were going to be doing this a lot and you want to live non-electrically like an Amish family, then it may be a good investment. So,
and those ringers, they are so valuable. Just saying. Anyhow, okay, so we've gone over water and food storage. I just forgot to mention in the food storage bit, if you lose your electricity, obviously you're going to also be losing your refrigerator. So you've got to kind of think ahead, and when you cook a meal with the food that you have, try and cook only what you're going to eat, and the rest is going to end up in the compost pile until refrigerator comes back on.
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, just something to kind of think about ahead of time with not having electricity. And that little solar contraption that Nick was mentioning that might work to run a few lights, maybe charge a phone or something like that, it's not going to be able to run your refrigerator. Just saying.
Unless
a lot
it's
of people,
a bigger one.
Yeah, unless it's a much bigger one. But a lot of people think, oh, well, I'll just get a little solar generator thing that I can run my fridge on.
Might run it for a day or two.
But not for very long.
Not for long term, and certainly not on cloudy days with the small amount of solar panels that come with those usually.
So you have to think about a cool room. A root cellar is great for storing some things.
Yep.
And yeah, just try and think about what you would do without a refrigerator.
Right. So the last system that we wanted to take a look at is hot water. What could you do for hot water in a non-electric scenario? And so naturally your mind might go to propane water heaters because they're using propane instead of electricity. And that used to be more the case, but much like with your cooking stoves, most of the modern, like especially tankless water heaters I'm thinking of, because we have a tankless, and ours is an old standing pilot one. And this is on my mind because every year that goes by, we keep thinking, when is it going to bite the dust?
Any day now.
We think it does, but then I get in there and I tinker around with it and manage to get another year out of it. And one of these years it's going to bite the dust, and we're going to have to get a new one. And so I've been looking at these things, and it's almost impossible to find a tankless propane water heater that requires zero electricity. Everything is electronic these days.
Yeah.
And not much, it's not a lot, but it requires a little bit or else it won't function. And so unless you can find one that is completely non-electric, then you might have to go with the old propane tank water heaters. Those are still, you can still find those that are non-electric, or the only thing that they might require is a little 9-volt battery or something like that. I know my folks got one of those a few years ago, and it was, just a little 9-volt battery. So that may be an option there. But for non-electric, still got to go back to the wood cook stove.
I know.
You mentioned this before. That's another one of the things that it can do is heat your hot water, even in a pressurized hot water system. Now, granted, if you're non-electric and you don't have a elevated tank to pressurize your water system, a gravity flow system, then you're probably not going to have pressurized water. You could with your hand pump, though. So there are ways, but if you don't have pressurized hot water, then that may change a few things. But still, your wood cook stove, you can get it with a water coil where stainless steel pipe comes into the firebox, does a 180 and goes back out. And that heats the water up, and then you can hook that up to a storage tank called a range boiler, and it can start a thermosiphon where without any electricity or anything, heat rises, and it just starts this cycle of the hot water goes out the upper tube going up to your range boiler, and when it does that, it pulls cold water in behind it, and it just starts this whole cycle if you set it up right, completely non-electric, and you end up with a tank full of hot water. Whether you have it pressurized or not depends upon the specifics of your situation, but you'd at least have a a tank of hot water there, or if you didn't have a pressurized water system, some of these wood cook stoves you can order them with a stainless steel tank on the back of the stove where it's actually sitting there on the stove and it's hooked up to the water coil and it heats up, and then it's got a little spigot on the bottom, and you can just go over there and open the spigot and it'll flow into your pot or whatever. So those are options for heating water. Also, a solar hot water heater. There are some really advanced solar water heaters out there that can squeeze an amazing amount of heat out of even cool days. And that could be an option as well. Once again, it goes into a storage tank, like a range boiler type situation. Some of them, depending upon how you have it set up, though, might require a circulation pump, an electric circulation pump. But you could conceivably set that up with a DC pump that's hooked up directly to a solar panel where it's only running when the sun is out. Yes, it's using a little bit of electricity, but wouldn't necessarily require a whole elaborate power system. So there's a lot of options out there. We could go deeper into that one. We've gone a little more depth into that on a previous podcast on hot water. But anyhow, I hope that going through these different systems gives you ideas that there are options for how you could do this. This is possible to do. No, it's not going to be anything like what you're used to right now. And that's why we really spend a lot of time focusing on the off-grid solar power systems, because what we'd really like to see is you living this lifestyle every day, because then you're going to be in the best possible position to take care of your family and be a help to others if you're living an independent lifestyle every day. That's the best possible scenario. But I realize that not everybody is in a position to do that right now. And so if that's you, then this could be an option. This could be a stepping stone, or maybe this is as far as you want to go with it. And if so, there are options. You can do this. Some of these are going to take a bit of an investment, like the wood cook stove or the hand pump on your well. Those are the two most spendy items. But, like we said, Dutch ovens are a low-cost alternative for the cooking. And with the hand pump, there are some cheaper hand pumps. No, they're not ideal, but there are some cheaper options. So just be of good cheer. There are options. Options are wonderful things. You can do this. And the point is to do what you can now. And when you have done all that you can do, the way will open before you to do what you could not otherwise do. So I would just encourage you to take the first step and do what you can. And getting some options for non-electric is a great first step.
I was just thinking, it might be really helpful and a lot of fun for your kids, especially, for you to set aside a day, like, I don't know, however often, once a quarter, where you just go and you flip the main breaker off and just experiment with surviving or trying to find non-electric options for some of the systems that we've been talking about. Make that just a ritual that you say, we have off-grid or non-electric backups in place. We're going to use them once a quarter. We're just going to flip the switch and we're going to have fun for a day. Just think about things like that and see, you might be surprised. You might flip the switch and realize, wait a minute, our propane oven won't work.
Right.
Surprise, surprise.
Yep.
Or you might find creative ways to work around some of the things that you do have and get them to work for you. So
that's a great idea. So do something. Take your first step, whatever that might look like. Take your first step and do what you can now.
That's right.
Y'all have a great week now.
Thanks.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.